finally done. Oh my goodness. Who's just starting?
Which lights
Who's got some left to do? All right, yeah, good. I'm doing good. Those are my people. I'm not alone for this. So, well, hey, the year was AD 325. This was about 300 years after the life of Jesus. And there was a council known as the Nicene Council. This was a gathering of some followers of Jesus, some theological scholars, and they were kind of, at this point in time, kind of realizing the need to kind of gather together and really kind of lay out and really identify and really clarify sort of the foundations of the Christian faith. Like if we were to kind of summarize really what we believe as believers. In fact, it's out of this council that we would get the Nicene Creed. How many of you have ever heard of that before? Yeah, it's kind of really the most basic, essential, foundational truths of our faith. And listen, I share that with you because it had some notable guests at this council meeting. One was a guy by the name of Arius. And Arius, he was kind of a scholar. He was considered a somewhat heretical teacher at the time because he really believed that Jesus was a good teacher, a good guy, but he struggled with the ideal of Jesus, the divinity of Jesus, the centrality of Jesus. And so when they're putting sort of this together and they're kind of talking over what they want in this creed, Arius kind of stands up and he starts to kind of argue against making Jesus kind of the center of the creed. And so he's actually kind of arguing against the centrality of Jesus, the divinity of Jesus. Now, there was also somebody else, though, at this council meeting. This is why I actually bring up this story. There was a guy who you may have heard of before by the name of St. Nicholas. Yes, that's St. Nicholas, the one that we attribute and connect to Santa Claus, right? And he was there at this meeting as well, and so he's listening to Arius kind of share a lot of this heretical kind of teaching there, trying to kind of pull Christ out of the center of this creed, the center of the doctrine, really kind of the center truth, foundational truth of our faith. And so he's listening to this, and the more he listens to it, like the more upset he's getting. In fact, so much so, he literally goes up to Arius and knocks him out. I kid you not, this is history right here. He literally just knocks him out. Like you thought our politics got rough, right? And I share that with you for a couple of reasons. One, as a good reminder, one more reminder to not get on Santa's naughty list. Because apparently St. Nick has a few anger management issues. Yeah, so it's like, he's on his bad side. But the other reason is to highlight this very real struggle, this very real fight we all face, especially around this time of year, especially in this day and age and culture we live in. We're in the midst of peppermint mochas and 24/7, nonstop movie marathons of It's a Wonderful Life and last-minute shopping deals. How many know it can sometimes be a struggle to remember what Christmas is really all about? The center. What is the message? If we were to kind of like the Nicene Council Creed, the Nicene Creed, if we were to really boil it down and really get down to what Christmas is all about, and it kind of leads me to sort of the big premise of what we're going to unpack tonight, and it's this: is that I think to understand the significance of the event, this event of Christmas, you've got to understand the importance of the invitation. To understand the significance of the event, you've got to understand the importance of the invitation. When I was growing up, I remember when I first started to kind of get into the Bible and started reading the Bible, I used to think because it had a whole bunch of rules, it was a rule book. And then as I grew up and started actually studying in Bible college, I started to see some of the history in it. Because that history, I started to think that it was a history book. But what I've come to learn, and over the years I've walked with Jesus more and more over the course of my life, is that, while there's certainly some rules in it, and while certainly there's history in it, it's less a rule book, less a history book, as much as it is a written invitation. And in fact, the entire kind of premise, not just the Christmas story, but the entire concept of the Bible, the truth spoken in the Bible, is this written invitation, all pointing to this moment, this event right here. And we see it in Luke chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. Luke chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. And just to kind of set the scene here, a little bit of the context here. Again, Mary's just given birth to the Savior, given birth to Jesus. And so here's kind of where we catch up to it. It says, and there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them. And they were terrified. But the angel said to them, don't be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. For all the people. That's going to be significant later on here in this message. It goes on and says, today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah. He is the Lord. Again, to understand the significance of the event, this event of Christmas, the event of the birth of our Savior, listen, you've got to understand the importance of the invitation. The importance of the invitation. Invitation that I don't know if you noticed this or not, was more than just simply coming and singing a few songs and lighting a few candles, which is great, it's good. But notice what these shepherds were invited to. These shepherds were ultimately, it was an invitation to draw near to God through a relationship with Jesus. It was an invitation to draw near to God through a relationship with Jesus. Which might explain why the angel says it's good news. Right? It's good news. Because, I mean, think about this. Like, when you think of things you've been invited to, and especially around this time of year, I think all of us can probably say we get invited to a lot of things, whether it be an office party, whether it be to a family function. And how many of you know that when you get invited to something, like even when you can't go, even sometimes when you don't want to go, how many know it feels good to be invited to something? Right? Like it feels good. Like it's like, man, this is good. I like that sense of just being invited. And which got me thinking, why is it that we place so much value? Why is it that it feels so good to kind of have this invitation? Whatever that invitation is. And it hit me this week. It hit me this week when I was opening up about the 20th invitation I've gotten over probably the course of the past several months. This invitation to apply for a credit card. Because apparently they really want me. Like they really like me, right? Now, funny thing is about these invitations to join is that though I know in advance I'm not going to apply, Holly would never let me apply, I still like to occasionally open one or two of them up. And to read those words that, Seth, you've been qualified. Okay, Visa? I didn't feel like I preached a great message a couple weeks ago, but I'm qualified. Yeah, that's good, right? Discover. Seth. Yes, Discover? You've been qualified. Okay, I like this, right? Really, you really think so? Yeah, okay. American Express. Seth, you've been qualified, right? And of course, as you read on, you start to kind of see some connection. There's a reason, though, of kind of why I've been qualified. And typically, it ends towards the end of these letters with this statement. It's like, you've been qualified because your score is good enough. It's good enough. Discover, you're qualified, you're enough. MasterCard, you're qualified, you're enough. And then it hit me, the reason why I think so many of us love to be invited is because to be invited means you're enough. Means you're enough. And when you're enough, you get an invitation. That invitation is a validation that you're enough. Listen, do you know that there are colleges that will invite you to study at them, to sleep in their dorms, rent-free, give you free meals, give you free books, give you free tuition, if you're athletic enough, if you're smart enough? Do you know you can really advance in your career if you're charming enough, if you work hard enough, if you got enough degrees, if you got enough references. And it feels good in that moment, right? It feels good in that moment to have that sense of validation for someone to say, you are enough. You are enough. And yet, how many of you know that on the flip side of that, though, it doesn't feel so good to discover that you're not enough, though, either. Have you ever had those experiences where you get an invitation only to ultimately be rejected, ultimately to have that sense that I'm not quite enough? You know, I still feel that way whenever I think back on the summer of '83. The summer of '83. I was a kid, was growing up in Maryland, and my parents, they decided to do this new summer tradition. And the summer tradition was that they wanted to take us down a couple hours south to this amusement park in Virginia called King's Dominion. And I remember I was so excited. I don't get to that just yet, but I was so excited to get to King's Dominion. And man, I was excited to get there. We're talking about all the rides, all the things that we were going to do. And man, I was pumped. Like several hours, me and my older brother just were laying out a game plan of how we're going to approach this. And so we get to the amusement park, and my parents, for some reason, like they didn't want to. I don't know, maybe just because of all the sugar and all the hype, they decided to just drop my brother and I off. Who knows what they did, outside of maybe hitting the couch and just relaxing. But they dropped us off at this park, and I remember my brother and I would get in the park, we get in kind of that first area, and we just start booking it to the back of the park. Because it's like, forget about the Bavarian Village, forget about giving Yogi Bear a high five. Like, we wanted to get to the back of the park, we wanted to get to Jungle Land, because in Jungle Land was where the real roller coasters were, the big roller coasters were. And I remember I was so pumped. My brother was telling me he'd actually been on one of these rides before, and he's like, oh, you're going to love it, it's amazing. And so we get there, and that's when I ran into it. Something that stood between me and my destiny. You got a little bit of a sneak peek of it. Why don't you check this out? This right here. This right here. In fact, I remember us getting up to it, and when we first got to it, they had a sign kind of at the beginning of the line. I remember my older brother, he's like, oh, don't worry about it. They never check the height. And so we go in there, we wait in line. What we did understand was that they had a redundancy system to this. Like they had an extra checkpoint right there before you got onto the line. So I remember getting up right on the cusp of riding this roller coaster, the moment of my life, only to have the guy call me over, say, hey, let's measure you real quick. And even though I was a tall kid, apparently, I wasn't quite tall enough. And so in my discouragement, in my dejection, I had to walk over, and I was invited to go to another place in King's Dominion. See, there was another kingdom, there was another land full of pastels and pony rides known as Camp Snoopy. A whole lot of slow rides, where all the rest of the kids didn't quite measure up, all the rest of the ones who were dejected, all the rest of the ones who didn't feel like they quite measured up. And I remember just sort of rolling and haunting my entire vacation. The whole time, like my older brother, he was trying to encourage me, invite me to ride some other rides, but I was like, I don't want to. I miss out my opportunity. I can't ride that one, so I just don't even want to ride another ride. And look, I share that because I wonder if for some of us, when it comes to, especially like the promises of God, I wonder how many of us sometimes do the same thing. God will invite us, maybe bring someone new into our life, or maybe bring a new job opportunity into our life, or maybe even invite into a new life, this relationship, this life that's found through this relationship with Jesus Christ. And yet when we hear this invitation, we turn it down. We kind of keep it at a distance because of that fear of rejection. That fear of not measuring up, because what experience tells me is what other people have shown me is that the moment I don't measure up, I can expect rejection. And so rather than risk being rejected by others, rather than risk even being rejected by God, I'm just not even going to I'm just not even going to accept the invitation to come. I'm not even going to take a chance on stepping into what God is inviting me to be a part of, what God is inviting me to in my life. And in fact, actually, there's a story in the Bible that I love. You know, the Bible, it's so relevant to our lives and our days and our situations. And it's a story that actually speaks directly to this, kind of that feeling, that sense of, and I think sometimes the big hesitancy, the wall that keeps so many of us kind of stepping into some of the promises of God. And specifically, the greatest promise of all, the greatest gift of all, even that gift of salvation. And we find it actually in Numbers 13. Numbers 13, just set the stage here. Basically, you've got the nation of Israel, the people of God, and God has delivered them out of Egypt, out of slavery, and He's leading them to the promised land. Now, the promised land, when we say that, it's also can be very symbolic to any of the promises that God has put on your life, and any of the promises that God has placed and spoken to you over your life. And so he's calling them there. He's calling them there, and of course, along the way, God does these miraculous things. He parts the Red Sea. He provides manna even in the middle of the desert. I mean, it's just incredible stuff, one miracle after the next. And so they get to the promised land. They get to this place where they're getting ready to kind of step over the edge, step over the line, to get to the place that they've been dreaming of, the life that they've been hoping for, that they've been longing for. And it's right at that moment they start to kind of freak out. They start to kind of back off of this invitation to step into their promise. And we see this in Numbers 13, verse 26. It says, they came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is the fruit. In other words, in so many words, what they're saying here is that, hey, I want to ride that ride. I want to ride that ride. That ride looks awesome. This new land, this new life looks amazing. But check out what happens. Verse 28. It says, but the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. And then verse 33, it says, and next to them, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. But listen, what kept them from receiving and stepping into that invitation to their promise? What's interesting is that if you notice and you read it, it wasn't what kept them out of the promise, and what kept them from the promised land. It wasn't how they saw God. They knew God could do the miraculous. They knew God could do amazing things. It wasn't how they saw God. It was how they saw themselves. See, because they thought that to accept this invitation, to receive this promise of a new life, this promise of a new land, this promise of a new hope, it was all about them being strong enough, them being tall enough, them being big enough, them being mighty enough, them having it together enough to step into this land. And yet in the face of, and rightfully so, I mean, think about it, you've been a slave for over 400 years, and so they were more than aware of how they didn't measure up, more than aware of how they weren't enough, and in the face of that, they literally turned from their promise. And look, I share that with you because this is kind of my one big point really for this morning, is that you got to understand, it's not enough to believe in God's promises for your life. You have to also believe in His preferences too. You have to believe in His preferences too. And this is why I love, when you go back to that story, in Luke chapter 2, you go back to the Christmas story, and you get some insight into His preferences and really what I mean by this. Because again, you can believe, and it's one thing to come in here, sing songs, talk about this invitation to a new life, a new hope, but it's another thing to actually believe in His preferences. And I think for a lot of us, because we struggle to believe in His preferences, we struggle to actually accept the invitation to step into His promises. And that's why I love, again, this this Christmas story, this story of the invite, as notice who God shows up to first, God gives this invitation to receive the greatest gift, the greatest, step into the greatest promise, this promise of a new life that's found through his relationship with Jesus. It's the shepherds. It's the shepherds. And despite what that song says, come on you faithful, we love that song. It's actually speaking of, singing about the shepherds. The truth is that they could have been farther from the words that we oftentimes sing in that song. Come on you faithful. The truth is the shepherds were seen as the farthest from being faithful. And in fact, a lot of people would see them as being faithless. Like they would never take the chance of putting their faith, putting their trust in a shepherd. As the shepherds at that time, they were sort of notorious for whenever a wolf would come and maybe risk eating, devouring one of the sheep they were in charge of watching over. If given the choice between protecting their life and protecting the sheep, they were notorious for choosing the latter. I'm going on my own. Like, good luck. I'm not risking my life. You don't pay me enough to risk my life for this sheep. And joyful. When you look at the Christmas story, and notice when the angels show up, they show up in the middle of the night. Now, I don't know about you, but around 2, 3 in the morning, I'm not very joyful if you're waking me up. Right? And then triumphant, the only reason these guys would have been shepherds is because they had failed at everything else. No one chose to be a shepherd. You ended up being a shepherd out of necessity. Because you tried to do everything else with your life, and only for it to fail, and only for you to end up being a shepherd. And yet these people, God shows up, the very ones that everyone else looked down at, God looked to first. And in doing so, gave us some insight into his preferences. Into his preference. Because I don't know if you know this, but God actually has some preference. Like when it comes to oftentimes those who God uses the most, God works through the most, God tends to call first, it's almost always those who are the most vertically challenged. In fact, if you're vertically challenged in any area of your life, hey, listen, I'm not just talking physically, but maybe spiritually, maybe relationally. Listen, this is a word for you. Is that I found that when it comes to God's preferences, listen, God has preferences. And listen, one of his favorite preferences of all is he loves to use and work and invite those who are short. He loves short people. He loves short people. He loves those who are short on time, those who are short on ability, those who are short on potential, those who are short on skill, those who are short on funds, those who are short on the rent. Those who fall short time and time again. His preference is for those who are short. Those who are short enough to recognize this gap. Recognize their need for a Savior. Recognize their need to be short enough to look up for their help. See, part of the problem, part of the reason I think so many of us never step into actually receiving the greatest invitation of all, this invitation of a relationship with Jesus and the promise of a new life, is because again, we think we're taller than we really are. We think we're less vertically challenged than we really are. Because the truth of the gospel message, I don't know if you know this or not, is that actually we're all vertically challenged. We're all vertically challenged. And in fact, check this out. In fact, the Bible is really clear about this. In Romans 3, verses 22 through 24, it says, there's no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And all are justified, though, but get this, all are justified by his grace. You know what the difference between really your ability and your destiny, oftentimes it's his grace. It's his grace. See, we're all vertically challenged. We're all short. That's why when I say when he has preferences, this is an exclusive thing. This is why the angels were able to say to the shepherds, listen, this is good news for all. Because all of us, when you get down to it, because of our sin, and because of the separation, that relationship with God, because of that sin, all All of us fall short of the glory of God. All of us are vertically challenged. And listen, this is where it really starts to get to the heart of really the meaning and the significance of Christmas. The significance of this message of Emmanuel, God with us. Because, listen, you've got to understand something. Jesus didn't just come to call us higher in life, to say, hey, you're good enough, you can do this, I believe in you. Listen, he didn't just come to call us higher in life. He came to call us out of death. In fact, his very name speaks to this. In the very name, when you look at his name, Jesus literally means saves. And Christ, I know, despite contrary of opinion, this might shock you, but Christ is not his last name. It's not like Jesus Jeffrey Christ. Christ actually means to be appointed for a task. See, Jesus, his very reason for coming down from heaven to earth, being born on that day, was because he had a task. And that task was to save you and me, which brings us back to why that phrase, that statement, Emmanuel, it's good news, God with us, is so significant. Because how many know you can't save someone that you're not near, that you're not with, that you're not close to? Like, imagine someone sinking, someone drowning in a pool. Like, you can't save them just by standing on the edge and saying, hey, you can do it. I believe in you. You swim harder, right? No, you want to save them. You got to get in the water. You got to get in the mess. You got to get in the situation. You got to get in the dirt with them. And that's exactly on that Christmas morning what God did for us. God with us. He came on this rescue mission. And here's why this matters, and here's why it's so significant for us. Because, and I think to kind of illustrate this, kind of share another story of another time in an amusement park. And I think it was, I believe it was back when my boy turned 8. We took him to Park Bullwinkles over in Wilsonville. And Bullwinkles, they had a ride there as well that Austin really wanted to ride. It was the go-karts. They had these go-karts. Anyone driven on I-5, seen Bullwinkle, see the little go-kart track? That's what Austin wanted to ride. And so we start heading there, and we get to the point where we're getting ready to get on this ride when, lo and behold, this same kind of sign shows up. But here's the thing. Here's what was cool about the Bullwinkle sign. It had something extra on the sign that one didn't have. See, on the Bullwinkle sign, what it said was, you must be this tall to ride if you want to ride alone. You must be this tall if you want to ride alone. See, if you wanted to ride on your own, it was a different requirement than if you came there with somebody who met the requirements. And listen, I share that with you, and that's the significance of this invitation when we accept that invitation to step into a relationship with Jesus. What you're doing is really, you're sitting there saying, hey, look, I recognize that on my own, I can't close the gap. On my own, that life that I so desperately want, because I'm telling you, without Jesus, it doesn't matter all the stuff you collect, all the stuff you buy, all the stuff you get, it will never feel like enough. Without Jesus, you will never feel like enough. But when you accept that invitation to draw near to God through this relationship with Jesus, and step into the promise of a new life, a new day, a new hope, a new future. Listen, there's no better gift. There's no better joy. That's why I said it's good news for all people. Good news of great joy is what it goes on to say. See, you don't have to be enough if you're holding the hand of somebody who's more than enough. And that somebody's Jesus. That somebody's Jesus. I want to pray for you tonight. And